a soldier who carries a mighty sword. He will tear your city down. Olay, olay, O Lord. Olay, 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 O Lord. He will tear your city down. Olay, olay, O Lord. There will come a poet whose weapon is his...
Hello and welcome to Dogs to Torches. In this episode, we are back again with Dr. Jared Goff to wrap up our episode on Duns Scotus and his Christology. How are you doing today, Dr. Goff?
I'm doing great. Thank you. How are you doing?
I'm really excited to wrap up this episode. I felt like this the last part went really, really well. And I figured that for this episode, we'd wrap up our discussion with respect to Scotus's understanding of Christology and the hypostatic union, and then discuss one of his more popular and famous doctrines, the primacy of Christ, and perhaps maybe discuss what consequences that might have for things like theology and philosophy, or nature and grace, or even with respect to Mariology.
Sounds great.
All right, so yeah, I figured. I mean, last time we discussed the different models in Christology: the horticulture model, the body-soul model, the chrism mixture model, and then finally the substance-accident model preferred by Scotus. And we also discussed Scotus's account of personhood and the communicability, incommunicability, understanding of hypostasis, and how that fits in both with his Trinitarian theology and his Christology. And yeah, I figured we'd wrap up that episode by discussing Scotus's account of Christ's human nature in relation to the Word, and then discussing his doctrine of the primacy. How exactly does Scotus account for the fact that Christ is a perfect human, and a particular human, even though that Christ isn't a human person, but is a divine person? How exactly does that work?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I suppose last time we discussed the different sorts of unions that help that we know through philosophy and human reason, that kind of help unveil the mystery while failing to fully capture the mystery of the hypostatic union. And so that's kind of the first major component. I suppose the second major component is what you're raising now, is why is the human nature of Christ not a human person? Or if you could phrase it differently, if it's a fully complete human nature, why is it not also a human person? So that's kind of the second major component. And I suppose this question kind of comes in two steps. The first step is to establish the relational nature of the hypostatic union, explaining how the union comes about and what particular about hypostatic union, or as Scotus will say, a transcendental relation of hypostatic dependence. What about it is the formal ground in terms of what makes this union to exist, and how this union is personal, but doesn't equate to a human person. The second step is, after we establish the question of relationality, is then the more difficult question perhaps is, how is it possible for an individual that is concrete and complete in a given order in Christ with respect to his humanity, the natural order, to be communicated to a hypostasis of a different and superior order, namely the divine hypostasis of the Word, without falling into some sort of composition, kind of a creeping generalization of monophysitism, or taking the other horn of the dilemma, simply making it a purely accidental union, which would tend towards a Nestorian Christology. So those are kind of the two main steps of Scotus, and really those two steps, are addressing those two questions, common to any kind of solution with respect to de verbo incarnato, the nature of the incarnation of the Word. And so I guess by way of preface then, there are really kind of two main approaches to the resolution of this question. They follow mainly, or in the main, the Scotistic line, or in the main, the Thomistic line. And there are some significant differences, not in terms of the doctrine, but in terms of the theological and metaphysical account of how the doctrine can be explained and better understood. So in the first step then, So let me back up a bit. So the issues essentially are union, nature, and personhood. How do we, those are the three main issues being considered when discussing naturally the hypostatic union. So moving on to the first step, we have to say that, and this is fairly general, that the hypostatic union is a relational union. And that's why we discussed in the first episode the different forms of union. It's a relation. And in this sense, because we're dealing with a divine person pre-existing and fully possessing the simple and infinite divine being, it must be a kind of non-mutual relationship. And what I mean by this is that in one term of the relationship is real and it's determinative of the subsistence of that term of the relation, and the other one, it isn't determinative of that point of the relata. So in a sense, that to use theological terms, the human nature of Christ does really depend and subsist in the person of the Word, but the person of the Word, because he's pre-existent and possessing the divine nature, in no way depends or is essentially characterized by the relationship that is the hypostatic union. And so that's the first question is what is the formal or the ground, the formal cause, reason, or ground of the termination of the human nature of Christ in the divine person of the Word, especially with respect to the definition of person. Now, we talked a little bit last time about Boethius's definition versus Richard of St. Victor's definition, and Scotus and Bonaventure follow. Bonaventure, he goes back and forth, but he ends up basically siding with Richard. So Boethius described a person as an individual substance of a rational nature. And Richard, Boethius's definition tends to emphasize rationality in terms of substance. Rationality and substance. And Richard's definition, which is a person is an incommunicable existence of an intellectual nature, this is where you see something that becomes very important for Scotus, that in a sense moves him out of the primary analogative or the primary metaphysical binome of act potency into communicability, incommunicability. And this is important for Scotus and Bonaventure because they're having to, for them, it's very important to establish personhood as distinct from nature. And of course, this is common, but personhood as distinct from nature in the two fundamental mysteries of the Christian faith, the Trinity and the Incarnation, wherein you have communication and you have incommunicability, but you don't have act and potency in the relevant sense. In God, there is no efficient, formal, or final causality in the Trinity, yet there's communication, incommunicability with respect to the persons and the nature, preserving the proper distinctions. And in Christ, or in the Incarnation, the question is important of communicability, incommunicability, because you have two natures subsisting in one divine person, wherein the divine person qua person is not acting in an efficient or formal manner in establishing that very union. So incommunicability, communicability is important in both mysteries, simply because Scotus is wanting to avoid the language of any language that might imply imperfection or composition between the divinity and the created humanity. So if it's a non-mutual relation, basically this under a general scope, this can be understood as kind of a transcendental relation, wherein the existence of a being in a lower order depends radically or transcendentally, something that extends beyond the predicamental categorization or attribution that you find in Aristotelian category. So it's not primarily a substance-accidents relationship. It's something more fundamental in terms of the ontology and ontology of dependence of this created nature in a divine and higher reality. In the created order, there's a general, in Franciscan ontology, there's a general transcendental relation that goes beyond the categories insofar as every creature, while it's embedded in Aristotelian categories and thus substance and accidents distinction, and predication. There also is something beyond, and that's in terms of the creative power by which even the order of substance and accidents obtains. So there's a general notion of a transcendental causality, or a kind of a transcendental dependency, or a kind of radical dependency on anything created. And this is attributed with respect to creation to the entire Trinity in unity, because the Trinity acts ad extra as one. But in the Incarnation, there's something more, or there's a further distinction to be made, because while the created human nature and the effecting of the hypostatic union is something common to the Trinity, nevertheless, the unique personal subsistence of the created nature of Christ is attributed solely to the second person of the Trinity, namely the Word. So Scotus is forced to further subdistinguish, and then, you know, this opens up a kind of wide field of theological and metaphysical speculation in the medieval sense, not just, you know, vain and wandering imaginations, but true speculation, trying to unpack and penetrate this mystery in terms of the most coherent or adequate account, theologically and metaphysically, of how this is even possible, how it makes sense. And so I'll just dive right into Scotus now that we've kind of laid some groundwork here. So, you know, according to Scotus, for the existence of anything, there must be a termination, like a reality, a bringing to existence, to concreteness, any essence, and that essence is as communicable in terms of subsistence. So for there to exist any essence or accidents, there must be a termination, either in existence itself with respect to the essence, or if an accident inhering in an existent or prior existent, even at least in the order of logic or reason and ontology, if not in time, an accident in the substance. And so the distinction here, though, is with any kind of natural union, you have substance accidents relationships, or if you want to get into the older metaphysics, you have partial substance relating and being ordered to another partial substance to form a complete composite. So a typical example would be in the Franciscan school, body and soul. They're incomplete substances, and they're ordered to one another, but nevertheless, they're of the same ontological order. Whereas the hypostatic union has a complete created substance being communicated to a higher substance, a substance of a higher order, namely the second person of the Word, meaning both properly speaking, the subsistence of the Word. And so this is the great mystery. So this kind of non-mutual relationship then between the person of the Word and the human nature, the complete humanity of Christ, is non-mutual. We already established that, and the higher relata is coming from the outside, so to speak, from another higher order. And so it's not embedded within the same created order, whereas in body-soul unions, it's in the same order. And so there's that transcendental aspect of this relationship in the humanity of Christ. And so by non-mutual, then, it means that there is a change in one term, namely the assumed term, without an ontological change in the higher term that's assuming the Word. And so out of this relationship, this reality of hypostatic union, a relation is made actual in the nature of the humanity of Christ, the created nature of the humanity of Christ, in terms of what Scotus calls a hypostatic dependence upon the person of the Word. And so when we see that this is a transcendental relation, we find that even though we've discussed various forms of union in the previous episode, it's in the most proper sense, not strictly speaking, philosophically speaking, especially in terms of Aristotelian or Platonic categories, a substantial or an accidental union, but rather it's a per se union, because it involves a hypostatic order, the order of personhood. And this order of personhood this union entails that there is no information or imperfection in either nature, and with respect to the nature. And so this is why it's called a hypostatic union, a union of hypostatic dependency, with, of course, analogates in the created order to substantial and accidental unions. And so by Scotus focusing on the person, he's trying to emphasize the issue of the communicability of a created nature to a higher order that renders that human nature incommunicable insofar and in the event that that human nature terminates in a person or hypostasis of a higher order. And so the kind of duality here is between person and essence in a similar manner with the Trinity, and precisely in terms of the mechanism or the modes of person and essence in terms of communicability, incommunicability. And incommunicability is prior because the incommunicability here is attributed to the person of the Word. And so for Scotus, then, he recognizes that there is an act-potency relationship, but it's not in the order of efficient formal causality, but rather in incommunicability and communicability. And out of this, he draws that that real existence is not possible except in terms of this relationship between communicability, incommunicability, or essence or person. And so in this respect, then, you find that when a rational nature or essence terminates in a hypostasis or an existence, Scotus will call this a kind of ultimate solitude, because there's an independence and there's an incommunicability. So what he means there is not solitude in terms of relation, but solitude in terms of real existence as independent of other existence, and here specifically hypostatic personal existence. But it's not in a sense to deny relatability. Clearly in the Trinity, it's the solitude of the independent existence of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit in the one divine nature that explains or is motivated through the intrinsic relationality, the personal properties of each person. So you have, again, in a perfect being, where the being itself is infinite, persons will be inherently relational, even if each person is this kind of solitude in terms of incommunicable existence. But their incommunicable existence precisely in that infinitely communicable divine essence that the Father communicates to the Son and the Spirit. And so in that sense, then, the ultimate definition of person for Scotus is Trinitarian person, where being a divine person is a positive perfection, because each divine person as independent also possesses the infinitely communicable divine being. Whereas in a finite person, there also is perfection in terms of the termination, because each created person, terminates in a distinct hypostasis, which then, by the very fact of that hypostatic termination, is an individual. But yet that individuality doesn't admit of the infinite communicability and then relationality of that essence, because we're parceled out, again, in and through the categories of substance and accidents, matter, that sort of thing. We're limited. So created personhood is essentially a limitation in our relatability, especially in terms of the natural order. We simply cannot operate or exist in this kind of perfect communion that is the Trinity. So for Scotus, then, when he thinks about personhood, divine personhood entails this positive perfection of inherent relation and relatability, where in created person, because we're limited, there's a certain kind of negation of that same relatability, at least in act. And so if we're going to be existing in a mode that is relatable or related perfectly, there's going to have to be an activation on either the hypostatic level or on the accidental personal level of operating in a mode that allows for a more perfect, I was almost quote, a more perfect mode of union. And so here another important point is that in this context of communicability, incommunicability, we see the bond or the connection between personal act terminating a nature of one's order or of another. And that's in the case of the hypostatic union, where a nature of another order is assumed by a higher person in a higher order. And coupled with that, embedded within this, and here's where the kind of the Greek patristic sources, especially coming through St. John of Damascus in Bonaventure and Duns Scotus, come through, is this notion of origin and or idea, in terms of, you know, how there can be an origin that is truly originating without falling into a kind of act potency metaphysics. And this is through the shifting of the discussion from act potency to incommunicability, communicability. And so the Father's first as incommunicable, but possessing the divine essence, which is inherently communicable in an infinite mode, then you find a distinction of origin and a termination in terms of the communication. And so this kind of sets the stage. And so we can move into directly how perhaps Scotus would differ from the Thomists. I'll try to run through this quickly. Let's see. So basically, I guess in a general character, generalizing, trying to think here. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds with respect to the difference. Essentially, though, the Thomistic school explains personhood primarily in terms of subsistence and how you explain the perfection of subsistence. It's a kind of additional perfection over and above human nature. While for Scotus, personhood essentially consists in a termination of an essence as individual and incommunicable. And so for the Thomist school, basically, you have the idea of the added perfection of subsistence, and then various ways of explaining that added perfection of subsistence. And this seems to be more of an act potency metaphysics. And there are about 4 different ways that the Thomists explain this through various distinctions. But the Scotus will just simply explain it as communicable, incommunicable. The essence is inherently communicable. The termination is incommunicable as the perfection, kind of the concretization of a given nature. And thus, the distinction between nature and subsistence can only be one that is formal rather than real in the relevant sense. And so that perhaps might require more unpacking as we go on. But kind of so the first step then was to explain the relation. The second step now is to answer how it's possible. And here we're referring specifically to the complete human nature of Christ, something that's posited and taught definitively at Chalcedon. How is it possible for a complete human nature, or generically speaking, a subject, complete and concretely, or concrete in the natural order, to be communicated to a hypostasis of another and superior order, while remaining in its natural integrity and being, I won't say existence, but being possessed and in some sense autonomous, at least secundum quid. So how do you have this human nature that is just simply isn't absorbed into the divinity or collapsed, or the divinity collapsed into that human nature, or just simply bite the bullet and say, well, they're not really related in a per se substantial subsistent union. And so, as I've already said, basically all the explanations tend to be Thomistic, or at least the best explanations tend to be Thomistic or Scotistic. And so let's first move through some basic Thomist types of solutions to this question. The first solution is subsistence is existence itself, and this is kind of the approach of Capriolis, Billiot, and others, De Latal, Karl Rahner. And this theory basically says that essence and existence are really distinct in creatures. But in Christ, since he's not a human person and does not exist in its own right, but exists rather by the existence of the Word, this must be either because the divine existence of the Word supplies, and so here's act potency, supplies for the existence of the human nature assumed, And this supplying is achieved through a kind of efficient causality. And in terms of the modern purveyors of this theory, de Latal or Ronner, the existence of the human nature is kind of quasi-formally activated by the act of existing of the divine word. And the problem there is that in terms of the identification of existence and subsistence in God, would seem to end up being Unitarian, because there's not a robust distinction enough between the nature and the persons. And in terms of the hypostatic union, then it seems as though you have a kind of composition through efficient causality or quasi-formal causality between the humanity and Christ, wherein the person or the existence of the word is supplying for something lacking, a perfection lacking in the human nature. So you have two questions. One, is the human nature then perfect and concrete in itself? And then two, another question would be, well, how is the nature of this union not a kind of composition or tending to composition? So that's kind of one main modern approach to this question. The second one is that subsistence itself is, and here kind of they're using Scotistic language, a perfective mode of the essence as singular. And this is more the line that Cajetan seems to take, maybe John of St. Thomas and Banyas. And here, it basically, subsistence itself is neither essence nor existence as really distinct, but a modality in the category or genus of substance that perfects the individual essence as singular, while being, in a sense, logically prior to the act of existence. And so on this account, yes, Christ is not a human person, because again, the subsistence of the word supplies for the ordinary human subsistence and existence. But again, the question is, does this really explain then the distinction between the divinity and humanity, as well as the completion of the completeness and concreteness of the human nature? A third mode is subsistence is a real mode terminating the existent as singular or individual. So in this account, Christ is a human person because his human nature is terminated not by a human mode of subsisting, but by that of the word. And so you see in common, they're really wrestling with the notion of subsistence as an added perfection to the essence of the human nature. So they're operating within an act potency binome as primary, not rather person essence. And anyone would admit, or at least should admit, that the entire discussion is very difficult and abstract. And it's very difficult to conceive person essence without using at least analogies of act potency. But because of the doctrine of the Trinity and because of the doctrine of the hypostatic union, it seems to me that you have to admit the distinction without affirming potency.
I see.
And so these are analogical attempts to account for a deep mystery based upon two really distinct or irreducibly distinct systems of metaphysics. And so in this third mode, essence and existence are not really distinct, but substance is a real mode terminating some existing being, again, in its individuality or singularity. So in Christ, in this instance, there's no human person, because human nature is terminated not by a human mode of subsisting, but again, by the mode of the subsistence of the word. And here you can see some of the language being borrowed by of Scotus in terms of termination by these Thomistic authors. And I think, from what I can tell, some of the main representatives of this approach are like Suarez, Vasquez, some of the Portuguese and Jesuit Thomists. Let's see. Now, I guess the fourth model is subsistence and nature are not really distinct, but only logically so. And this seems to be the account of like Franzelin, Galtier recently. So in this account, Christ is not a human person, because again, he's terminated by the word, and because he's terminated by the word, his human nature no longer has the reality or character of human subsistence. And so there's no sense of the reality or concreteness of Christ's human nature existing apart or for itself.
Okay.
It exists in and through and for the Word. But on this account, because they move away from real distinction to merely logical distinction, then you might wonder, well, if it's merely a distinction of reason, how again is there union? Or if there's union, how is this not a collapse into a kind of act potency metaphysics that sounds, again, Monophysite? And so those are kind of the four main Thomistic theories. And you can see as theological discussion advanced and moved in and through the period of second scholasticism, that a lot of the criticisms of Scotus were at least being dealt with, and even certain moves were being made and terminology being used that hearkened to Scotus. Okay, now directly to Scotus. For Scotus, again, then, incommunicability doesn't obtain or consist in anything that is really distinct, i.e. independent or separable in either God or creature. So he bites the bullet and says, incommunicability doesn't entail a real distinction. And here's the point where that we mentioned a little bit earlier. Rather, incommunicability in God consists in a relative perfection. Now, it can't be an essential perfection. It's a relative perfection because it pertains to the other persons, but also to the divine essence as terminating the divine essence in a distinct hypostasis. And this is where Scotus and earlier Bonaventure use the formal distinction. So the distinction has to be robust to explain the difference between essence and termination without entailing real separation or real independence with respect to the person and the essence, without also merely being reduced to a logical or virtual distinction, as in maybe Rahner, that tends to collapse the Trinity into a kind of Unitarian or suggest Unitarianism. So in God, it's a positive perfection because each divine person possesses the infinite essence, infinitely communicable. Whereas in creatures, Scotus argues for a double negation with respect to specifically, because he's beginning his metaphysical contemplation on the fact of the hypostatic union. So he's taking the hypostatic union as the concrete instance of the greatest perfection and perfectibility of a created nature. And so then when he's talking about personhood, he's thinking of created personhood, not in relation to generic categories of Aristotle, but rather in relation to or in comparison to that perfect instance of created personal existence. That is the hypostatic union. So Scotus, when he accounts for created personhood, he says, yes, Boethius's account is true, but it's inadequate. Richards helps us understand a little bit better the priority of the primary distinction between person essence and incommunicability, communicability. And then when considering created persons, he says, what all created persons need to be compared to is the hypostatic union. Because in the hypostatic union, you have the absolute and radical perfection of a created intellectual nature, actually an individual existence of an intellectual nature, yet not a created person. So when he talks about created persons, then he says created persons are conceived in terms of what he calls a double negation. It's not negative. The language is negative, but the point is to compare everything to Christ, rather than having some abstract generic account of rational animal, a genus with a difference, in order to come up with a species. So he's already assuming all that. But given the fact of the incarnation, how do we understand created person? And this is why he says created personhood stands in a double negation with respect to a double negation of certain potencies, obediential potencies, or aptitudes with respect to the hypostatic union. So, this idea of a double negation of hypostatic dependency brings us directly into the theory of Scotus in terms of created personhood, and why, for Scotus, it's rational to affirm that Christ is not a created person. And so in this sense, then, the double negation entails a denial of First, the aptitudinal dependence or need of being communicated to a term distinct from itself, or the need of being terminated hypostatically by another being or agent of a higher order. And so the distinction would be when you affirm an independence, you're negating any aptitude for further termination. So so body and soul are not independent from one another. They're in the same order. There's a certain kind of coordination and then dependency upon each other in an ordered manner in order to arrive at a complete human substance. So when you deny aptitudinal dependence, you're saying there is no need for this being or essence to be terminated in anything else, because there already is the termination existing. And in that respect, then, when there is an absence of a hypostatic termination, meaning an assumption by a higher agent of a higher order of a created nature, when that is not actuated, that potential is not activated, well, then simply the nature itself terminates in itself. And so this is what it means by the negation of an aptitudinal independence, because once it terminates independently, it has no further need for termination for its subsistence. Its subsistence is explained in the fact that it terminates in itself and not in a higher being, in a higher mode. The second negation then from aptitudinal dependence is actual dependence. This is also negated in a created person. And so this means that when you deny actual dependence, that means that this nature de facto is not communicated to another term. And so when you have the distinction or the separation between body and soul, the soul and the body are always aptitudinally ordered to dependence, or at least interrelation between one another. But in their union, there is no more aptitude for this kind of interdependence. And then when you talk about dependence of the substance and you deny actual dependence, you're saying that this substance exists or subsists in itself. So it subsists, going back to this notion, in an incommunicable way and in a manner that is quasi or independent secundum quid. There is no further termination or communication of this concrete substance in a different substance of a higher order. And so when both of these forms of hypostatic dependence are negated, you have a human person. And so that's what he means by the double negation. He's looking at human personhood primarily in terms of the mysterious personhood, divine personhood of Jesus Christ, in which the aptitudinal and the actual dependence are activated. They're not negated.
I see.
And so in this sense, when I guess summarizing, because created personhood is a kind of negation rather than a positive perfection, this is important, because if it weren't the case for Scotus, well, then the human nature of Christ couldn't be assumed. If there wasn't this intrinsic obediential potency for this kind of activation in and by a person of a higher order, distinct from the created order, which would normally be the realm of termination for created persons. If there wasn't this aptitude or obediential potency, then the hypostatic union couldn't have occurred. But since we know the hypostatic union did occur, then we can have deeper insight into the constitution of the created person with respect to the hypostatic union that then situates and unveils, in a sense, the deepest potentialities for created nature, but especially and specifically created rational nature. So in this sense, then, we find that through the affirmation of both aptitudinal dependency and actual dependency, we find the locus of what Scotus is saying explains the divine personhood, yet created reality and existence of a complete human nature. And this is all being filtered through the binomial of person and essence, of incommunicability, communicability, and the way in which these things relate. And so the causality is not explained precisely because we have no created analogate for the causality, because when we think of causality, we think primarily in terms of efficient and formal. Right. But efficient and formal are not an operation in the hypostatic union proper, nor is it an operation in the Trinity in a proper sense, maybe in an appropriated or metaphorical sense it's operated. But Scotus calls this uniquely personal or terminative causality, not any of the Aristotelian categories. And one must admit that the account is opaque, but he gives further commentary, and later Scotists further commented on ways in which personal causality even is operative in the created order with and amongst created persons. And I think the primary locus for, say, Bonaventure is with respect to that unique act of personal judgment, by which there's a comparison between the things known and the metaphysical necessary conditions for those things to obtain, even though we don't have full or direct access to them. Nevertheless, we make a judgment that isn't simply reducible to the three acts of the mind. And so there's a kind of spontaneity and personal causality that seems to be operative that isn't captured by traditional philosophical categories. And so we're entering into the realm of the mysterious and the personal. And the primary theological loci or locuses that we look at to begin to understand the mystery of personal causality is precisely the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the interplay, the order of grace between the uncreated gift of charity and the personal spontaneity of the free will operating in and through created grace. And so for the Franciscans then, personal causality is located in that kind of radical spontaneity that doesn't imply arbitrariness, but still a kind of radical spontaneity of the will that isn't explained by anything but the will doing what it does. And so we can find avenues of discussion that seem to be phenomenologically and psychologically, in terms of introspection, evident, but insofar as they're kind of per se or immediately evident, you can't prove them by anything else. Rather, we reason and prove everything else by the kind of immediate evidence of the mysterious reality of the spontaneity of the will, at least in terms of a Scotistic Bonaventurean account of the will. So, the third point then that really this raises is it opens up theological and metaphysical speculation much broader. And this is, we were talking before the show about the ways in which philosophy and theology, reason and faith interrelate. And this is kind of getting into the very core of why Scotus, and before him Bonaventure, and really the Franciscan school, while affirming the distinction between philosophy and theology, would balk at a notion of a fully autonomous philosophy, precisely because it can't get to the very core of the obediential potencies of the created order, especially in terms of the possibility of the hypostatic union, because this, in a sense, opens up the most radical kind of dependency of a created nature, not just in terms of operation or in terms of the habit of sanctifying grace, but all the way down into the core of the subsistence of a created nature, wherein that created nature is fully what it is in concrete, yet radically, in the most radical hypostatic sense, for its very existence, dependent upon divinity, namely the divine person. And so in this sense, it opens up a discussion of the depths of obediential potency that moves into the realm of metaphysics, but goes into discussion that metaphysics of itself, apart from the revelation of the hypostatic union and the philosophical insights that the hypostatic union affords, both with respect to created nature and its obediential potencies, as well as the revelation of the Trinity, specifically through the hypostatic union, the perfection of uncreated nature, uncreated person in the Trinity. So in this sense, we can understand why St. Bonaventure, a generation before Scotus, would call Christ the one teacher of all, because he in his person and in his existence, he unveils the heights of the perfection of being in the Trinitarian reality of God, but he also unveils and plumbs the depths of the possibility of creation, insofar as creation isn't just a concurrent reality with the causality, the created causality of Christ. Creation isn't just being accidentally perfected through grace, but creation actually can and really does subsist or exist in the fullest sense in the divinity, insofar as the full and complete created human nature exists and subsists in this relation of hypostatic dependency on the part of the human nature, terminating in the divine person of the Word, everlastingly now, for its own perfect personal existence. So Scotus would say then Christ is not a human person, because Christ has activated the potency, the obediential potency for hypostatic dependence upon a person of a higher order, whereas all created persons negate both the aptitudinal and actual dependency, and thus terminate independently within the created order, distinct from this relation of hypostatic dependency. And so that I think, in a nutshell, well, maybe a big nut, encapsulates the Scotistic theory of the De Verbo Incarnato, as distinct from what you might call the charismata, the perfections of the human nature by grace, and kind of the operative activities of Christ in his human nature throughout and within salvation history.
Thank you, Dr. Goff. That was a very, very wonderful presentation. And maybe going off that tangent of maybe switching topics, we could discuss the operations of Christ in salvation history, particularly with respect to the question of primacy and the motive of the incarnation. Because I think this question is very interesting, because in Scotus, and correct me if I'm wrong, he represents something of a paradigm shift in the way in which medieval theologians would tackle the question about the motive of the incarnation. I mean, prior to Scotus, theologians would examine the question of the motive of the incarnation based off the fittingness of the incarnation, or maybe the self-diffusive nature of goodness and its relation to the created order. Whereas Scotus is more interested in questions of finality and what he calls the signa rationis, the logical steps of the created order, and how Christ stands in relation to those logical steps. And what's interesting is that medieval theologians and Renaissance, figures, Baroque figures, they all tackled the question on Scotus's own terms, or on the question of finality, or questions of like the logical steps of the created order, even if they want to uphold the traditional Thomist, mainline Thomist position that the fall is a sine qua non condition for the possibility of the incarnation in this temporal order. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think that is true. The scholarship of people like Trent Pullen, Father Dylan Schrader, I think they've fairly well established. Plus, if you just look at a bibliography that somebody, say like Juniper Carroll in his Why Jesus Christ, clearly indicates that there was a shift and a recognition that Scotus, at the very least, clarified the question. The question at issue with respect to the incarnation, and in a similar way clarified the question with respect to the Immaculate Conception. I think beforehand you find, and this is somebody, I'm forgetting his first name, but the Italian author Ricci wrote around the turn of the century, probably the definitive 2-volume work on the question of the motive of the incarnation. It's in Italian, unfortunately, but it provides a wonderful treasury of patristic argument and citations, as well as biblical, rationale. Kind of, and his goal was to defend the Scotistic thesis. But I think in common, most of the fathers and the medievals, as you alluded to, while discussing and in a sense affirming the absolute primacy, kind of basically the explanation of, or the answer to the question of why is there anything rather than nothing, will affirm that Christ has a priority. But on the other hand, a lot of them would, as you mentioned, argue from a kind of fittingness, and those arguments are not incorrect. But in terms of fittingness, there can be a kind of theological rationale or account by anticipation, kind of what Newman would call in his Grammar of Assent antecedent probability, where you expect something like this to occur, but you can't quite pin it down in an analogous manner to, say, the notion of a triadic God on the basis of creation. We could kind of expect this, but it's nothing in creation, apart from the fact of the revelation, would lead us to the theological scientific certainty, the dogmatic certainty that such was the case. And I think, and another key point, and this is something that even Bonaventure kind of alludes to. It's an important distinction that many people who affirm that would hold that Bonaventure affirmed the absolute primacy later in life, through his Collations and Hexameron, as distinct from his earlier sentence commentaries. I think and this perhaps also is something that you find in a figure like St. Maximus the Confessor, although I'm not an expert, is the understanding of the Incarnation as the perfection of the created order, as though the perfection of the created order is coming from within the kind of natural disposition and dynamism of the created order as such, and so therefore becomes kind of quasi-exigency of the created order. And Bonaventure seems to affirm, as he moves closer to what will become a Scotistic position, the Incarnation primarily in terms of the perfection of the universe, rather than something that is absolutely gratuitous, and all the universe in terms even of its perfection is willed primarily, or in the first place, because God willed to communicate himself ad extra in terms of this unique and radical hypostatic union. It's in a sense confusing the order of priority. And in a sense, it's a kind of primacy of Christ from below, a primacy of Christ from the exigencies of creation and the need of creation to perfect itself. Now, of course, figures like Thomas Bonaventure knew that nothing in nature considered abstractly, according to its own inner exigencies, required either the Incarnation or grace. But in terms of, say, Bonaventure's later explanation, he seems to talk that way. And it was really Scotus who clarified the question, and then that clarification became determinative, basically, for all subsequent discussion. And Scotus's main point is that agreeing with Bonaventure, but clarifying or making crystal clear, because Bonaventure is clear enough, the principle of the good is diffusive of itself, the Dionysian principle. He clarified perfectly and clearly that God is goodness, but when God chooses to act ad extra, and then that order of his ad extra activity is established, it's established primarily by his will, exercising that goodness that tends to be diffusive of itself ad extra. It's primarily through the will, and so the will is then determinative of any order that obtains ad extra. And so primarily then the good is not just some sort of emanational diffusion, hearkening to the kind of love, joy, and great chain of being. It's not necessitarian in any sense. It's actually rooted primarily and solely in the election, the elective operation of God to create ad extra, and create ad extra with a certain purpose. And this is where Scotus clarified the problem, is that God in creation first wills this radical kind of union between himself and creation, and a radical dependency and fulfillment of creation in terms of the hypostatic union. And so he first wills, his motive of will is love, and the end of his will to create is the manifestation of that love and his own glory ad extra. And so when he conceives of this, because of the fact, again, of the hypostatic union, we wouldn't be able to know this apart from the fact. But because the hypostatic union is the what the scholastics would call the ne plus ultra, he can't act any more perfectly ad extra apart from the hypostatic union. When he wills then the hypostatic union, and primarily in terms of the hypostatic union, the glory of Christ in his humanity. The glory, A, that pertains to the dignity of his person, and then B, to the perfection of every grace in terms of habitual sanctifying grace and charism that created person can possess, and then through that possession operate. So he wills perfect relation and then perfect gracious perfection. And then he wills, I'm falling into it. Another key point, let me back up, because you mentioned the signa ratione. With respect to God's will, remember, because God is simple and an act, his will to create is singular. And so when we talk about the signs of the divine will or the eternal decrees, we have to understand that these are logical instants. They're a certain kind of logical ordering. They're not, and they can't be, otherwise you'll end up in complexifying God and then attributing to God's will a kind of absurd set of contradictions. And you know, even great scholastics in the period of second scholasticism would fall into this. They'd move into a discussion of the decrees or the signs of the divine will as though they're distinct. But really what's at play is one decree, one will act to create with a certain order that explains the rationality of that will act. So when we divide up decrees or signs of the divine will, we're talking about one will act that begins in God and terminates ultimately in the eschaton. We're not talking about distinct acts, so there's no contradiction. But they're also, because of God's omniscience, there's a foreknowledge of the events that will occur, and then the means by which he will achieve that one end of the glorification of Christ, as well as his bride, in through the mission of the Holy Spirit in the church. And so in that sense, then, the first sign, and if you want to use metaphorical language, the first decree is the hypostatic union and the glory of Jesus. And then in the second sign or decree of that one will act, then all the elect in Christ. And then the third sign or decree is the creation of man himself, and then the vision of the fall. And then in order to fittingly achieve that glorification of Christ as head, but also of Christ in and with his body, the redemptive mode of the incarnation, terminating in salvation history in the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. And then with respect to the perfection of the church and the recapitulation and perfect union, that preparation of the bride that Paul speaks of in Ephesians, the recapitulation of the church in and through and with its head Christ through the operation of the Spirit, already achieved in Mary in the Assumption, and then will be fully manifest. And in terms of extension, not in terms of substance or quality, but in terms of extension, recapitulate all the elect in light of kind of the vision at the end of the apocalypse of the New Jerusalem descending. And so in that sense, Scotus clearly, in formulating the problem, he identifies clearly the distinction between natural modes of operation and a voluntary mode of operation, and then specifies that all creation has to be seen primarily in terms of God's voluntary charitable act to create that has within itself a certain order. And because of the incarnation, we know that the incarnation is the best. And because we know that God is a most orderly willer, he orders the best first and all the means to achieve that best in terms of the first. So the end is glory. And on both sides of, say, the division or the distinction between the signs of the divine will, where do we end up? We end up in glory. And so Scotus would then, and later Scotus would subdivide then, the terminus is the glory of the God-man. But the mode to achieve this is modified in terms of the prior vision of sin and the fall, and thus the redemptive mode. And so the Scotistic school distinguishes then within the notion of salvation. It distinguishes salvation proper, which is glory, and then for the bride, theosis, and redemption. Now, redemption is recapitulated up into glory,
Right.
but glory is always the final purpose. And thus, for the Scotus, they have no problem then saying that the substance is always glory, but the mode in which it terminates is going to be through redemption, precisely because of the fall. But Christ is apart from the fall. Christ has no part of the fall, and the predestination of Mary, construed in a Scotistic sense, which seems to have some backing in Ineffabilis Deus, wherein Mary is explained or spoken of as being predestined in one and the same decree, and the fact that she is immaculate. It seems also then that Christ and his bride, qua glory, are predestined independently, but not separate from the redemption of the rest of his brothers and sisters fallen in Adam. So in terms of Christ and Mary, you have a unique case of the perfection of the purposes of God's creation ad extra. And in a sense, you have this foreshadowed because the termination of the initial creation was in Adam and Eve, and their termination, the creation, was ended before the fall occurred. So the goodness of creation was willed for its own sake in this bridegroom duality, seemingly foreshadowing the ultimate perfection of Christ and his queen mother, his spiritual bride and mother of the church. Nevertheless, through the historical event of the fall, the bridegroom analogy, while preserving the primordial perfection, is routed through the redemptive mode, which entails the passion, death, and resurrection of our Lord Christ. That's in a sense the kenosis of Paul in Philippians. So I think in that sense, then, an important distinction is just how, or the importance of Scotus is how he framed the discussion, not primarily in terms of fittingness or in terms of any kind of intra-creation exigencies, but rather really trying to identify the purposes of the divine will based upon what happened. And based upon what happened, this feeds back into our earlier conversation of the distinction between the de verbo incarnatum, or incarnato, and soteriologia. De verbo incarnato has to do with Christ and glory, and Christ both head and members from glory to glory. But soteriology specifically takes up the question of the mode in which this actually occurs through the recapitulation and the redemption and salvation of all the elect. And now, of course, you can't. Somebody might, of a more egalitarian mind, will say, well, if Christ could have been predestined and Mary could have been predestined prior and apart from any consideration of sin, well, why couldn't Adam and Eve also have been predestined and all of their progeny? Well, Scotus would say, well, in fact, they were. So the distinction then is the nature and perfection of the graces given to Christ and Mary as distinct from the rest of the sons of Adam. And this is rooted in the mystery of God, but fittingly perhaps able to be articulated in terms of, again, their dignity as persons. One is a divine person, and the other one is the literal mother of a divine person. And so in that respect, and they're both intended to be heads of creation, head and bride, but co-heads of all of creation, insofar as Adam and Eve were co-heads of all creation before the fall. And so, yeah, I think that's the important distinction, is that Scotus clarifies the nature of the question. And then with respect to subsequent theories, I think clearly the arguments from any kind of necessity or any kind of inevitability on the basis of fittingness fall down just simply because of the incommensurable distance between God and creation, but also the supernatural order or mode and the natural order of mode. There's nothing except the absolute gratuity of the will of the Father that explains the incarnation. There's no necessity. And so, you know, if you're going to boil right down to it, I still think that, you know, looking at the Salamanticenses, very interesting theorists, very interesting discussion of the motive of the incarnation. Later theologians, more of a historicist, Hegelian stripe, such as, you know, maybe Archbishop Bruno Forte, that, you know, Peter Fellner has written some devastating critiques, but we don't need to get into those. As well as there was another point. The Salamanticenses, and some Latter-day Scotists even kind of following into, and this is something that even Father Juniper Carroll kind of ascribed to, and another great Scotist, Jean-Francois Bonnefoy. They both kind of ended up falling back into the Salamanticensian line, in which, and you've had Father Dylan Strader, so I won't go into that discussion. But I think in reality, those theories end up being internally unstable because they don't really identify the nature of the intention and the ultimate finality. And I think they end up sneaking in, at least in terms of a sine qua non condition, which I find irrational, sin into the equation that terminates in the incarnation. And I just don't see how you can make sin a necessity, either for creation or with respect to the incarnation, especially given the fact that God is the most orderly lover, the perfect lover, and the most orderly willer. He would have willed the greatest good independently and all other goods for the sake of that good. So I think in that sense, you're really stuck with, and of course Aquinas and Bonaventure both agreed in the rationality of what would become the Scotus position. But I think you're left with, Aquinas still has the best account of the post-lapsarian incarnation. It's the most consistent because he consistently upholds that the incarnation was willed because of sin. It wasn't willed prior to sin. Whereas all the other kind of mixed schools, the mitigated Scotistic or mitigated Thomistic schools, end up, I think, becoming internally incoherent. Whereas Scotus and St. Thomas present very clear and consistent theories. They're just irreducible to each other. And both are permissible. And in that sense, one has the choice of electing what position he will hold. Although I do think that, and Monsignor Arthur Calkins wrote a paper on the recent ordinary magisterium, and it seems as though the ordinary magisterium, especially of the last 50 to 70 years, is seemingly tending towards a more Scotistic account. And you can think of Gaudium et Spes as instances of, and as well as the New Catechism, as instances of leaning towards the Scotistic position, but clearly not defining it or requiring it. There seems to be a certain tendency, as with the Immaculate Conception, to kind of affirm that Scotus kind of got this right, but nevertheless, it's not subject to dogmatic definition, at least yet.
So I wonder if Scotus's insights with respect to the incarnation and the primacy of the incarnation, I wonder if it has any consequences with respect to his Mariology. I mean, we already discussed and alluded to this with respect to Ineffabilis Deus, with respect to Mary's predestination and joint predestination with Christ. I wonder if this has any connection at all with his doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, because Scotus, of course, is famous for defending the Immaculatist thesis with respect to Mary and original sin. But I wonder if it has even, we can take it a step further and wonder if it has any consequences with respect to Mary's relation to salvation and redemption, if any, if Mary was ever supposed to have been redeemed, or if she was merely saved. I wonder if that's a topic that Scotus could take up.
Right. Well, yeah, there are several points that are quite important, and I would say, just simply beginning, Scotus accepted the doctrinal commonplace that Christ was the most perfect Redeemer, and so he was able to conceive of redemption in a more perfect way than redemption from sin. And so that was kind of the brilliant insight of Scotus with to the Immaculate Conception, is that if Christ is the most perfect redeemer, a redemption that prevents one from any association of sin, regardless of the de facto historical situations, but that preserves one from falling into original sin or being obliged to fall into original sin, but rather preserves that justice, or rather, more importantly, the equivalent and superseding of that justice that Adam had in the garden. He said, well, this is just simply follows from what everybody already believes with respect to Christ and his redemption. And what is more fitting than that he redeem his mother in this most perfect way, because this preserves the typology of bride and groom. And it also uniquely speaks to Mary's maternal action, which again, Scotus, following the Damascene and going against St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure, affirms that Mary is substantially and really the mother of the Son, whereas Bonaventure and Thomas have a certain different account. They assert that Mary is not in the most proper sense the mother of the Son, because the Son already existed. Whereas Scotus says maternity and paternity have to do with the order of the communication of nature, not the priority of existence or lack thereof of person. So Scotus goes back beyond the medievals to the Greek tradition, especially St. John of Damascus, and goes against Thomas and Bonaventure on this point. And I think it's actually a beautiful point, because what it actually does is it establishes the uniqueness of Mary and the substantial participation, which of course Thomas and Bonaventure would have affirmed, but perhaps inconsistently, insofar as the active agency of Mary in conceiving and bringing forth God. And so Mary was an active agent, not merely a passive instrument.
Right.
Insofar, and she's really and truly and substantially the mother of the Son of God in the literal sense, because she brought forth from her substance his complete human nature, which again is really his now for all eternity. And so this reality, or these 2 points of the most perfect redemption and the active maternity of Mary in Scotus's teaching, are really the capstone of Bonaventure's developed teaching on the active role of Mary vis-a-vis the Incarnation and the Church. Because St. Bonaventure, although he couldn't ever come to affirm the Immaculate Conception, A, because it was improperly formulated at the time, and then B, St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure both held to, I think, an essentially post-lapsarian theory of the Incarnation. If Mary was accurately conceived, well, she's no longer under the ambit of Christ's redemption and salvation. And so in this sense, then, Bonaventure is really providing the conditions for explaining Bonaventure's very robust and still probably the most metaphysically penetrating and comprehensive account of the co-redemption before the Word in the history of the Church. Bonaventure is, in a sense, the doctor of the co-redemption. And what this means, essentially, is that Mary is active. And it's funny, because you have language of the Paschal mystery already in Bonaventure. Bonaventure affirms that Mary is active personally in what he calls the 3 phases of the Incarnation: the bringing forth, the offering, and the possessing of the price of our redemption. And so in this sense, she stands, in a sense, prior to the operations of Christ as being the most perfect beneficiary, because she brings forth Christ in her divine and virginal maternity. She offers both at the temple, but then in the fullness of the sense, John 19:25-27, when she's standing at the foot of the cross, and Jesus says to John, or to Mary and to John, woman, behold thy son, son, behold thy mother. She's offering, or co-offering, in this kind of deepest association with Christ through her will and her compassion with Christ. She's co-offering in a created personal mode what the divine person operates in his and through his created humanity. And then by virtue of her unique activity and her assumption, this is really the effects of the assumption, she possesses that price of our redemption, because she brought what she brought forth, what she offered, she possesses in all eternity, and thus she is active in the subjective distribution of graces in the church through her intercession and her maternal role. She's active in the subjective application of the objective price of our redemption that she brought forth in her virginal maternity. And so in this respect, then, Scotus's understanding of the most perfect redemption really explains the condition for why Mary can act in an active sense, not merely in a passive sense, in terms of the redemption, because she stands prior to the redemption from sin by virtue of her Immaculate Conception. So Scotus, in a sense, is filling out the Mariology that was quite traditional in the Western Church, even going back to St. Bernard, and articulated most fully by St. Bonaventure by providing the metaphysical condition for her compassion and her association with Christ in virtue of the Immaculate Conception. Now, this brings up an important point that we need to move back in terms of the predestination. And Scotus speaks explicitly of the predestination of Mary, at least at length in his writings. But later Scotus took up this topic because they were building upon and expounding upon Scotus's theory of the predestination of Christ, and then the privileges that Mary has by virtue of her divine maternity and her Immaculate Conception. And so this is where the predestination comes in, is that for both Christ and Mary, in terms of the Franciscan school's predestination, yes, they're predestined to glory in the relative modes and perfections prior to sin. But because of the fall, the Incarnation and the Immaculate Conception are simply not dissociated from sin. Both the Incarnation and the Immaculate Conception take on a coloration because of sin. And so in that respect, the binary of original sin and Immaculate Conception have to be understood together in the actual economy of salvation, distinguished from the order of intention, because how the decree, the one eternal will, is brought into its reality is precisely incorporating and recapitulating the fall and the redemption. And so Mary is saved in the univocal proper sense as raised to divine life, but yet the mode in which she is saved is still in and through the fallen order. And so she is able to have compassion with Christ and suffer with Christ and merit for us, because of her Immaculate Conception, uniquely, what otherwise, apart from the Immaculate Conception, she would not have been able to merit. So in that sense, with respect to your question about her being saved or redeemed, Scotus, very carefully, and later Scotists, prioritize the predestination, the absolute predestination and unconditioned predestination of Jesus and Mary to glory. But nevertheless, the mode in which that is achieved in its terminus and in its historical and eschatological manifestation is bound up and associated with the fall. So Mary is received, and there is an association to sin now in the actual execution of her Immaculate Conception and her divine maternity, precisely because she is truly, as with our Lord, a son and daughter of Adam and Eve, even though they were willed prior. Adam and Eve were willed in terms of eschatology and perfection, in terms of Christ and Mary, but in the order of execution, Christ and Mary follow. And so when we say redemption, Mary is truly redeemed, because had she not been redeemed in this preservative way, by virtue of her absolute predestination with Christ as immaculate, she would have incurred original sin. Now, this brings us to the debitum. I think the debitum became a theological topic of note precisely in response to debates between especially Dominicans and Franciscans over the nature, of original sin in the Immaculate Conception, and when one can no longer be called a heretic for affirming the Immaculate Conception. It's really pushing back the question of the priority of sin relative to the Incarnation, meaning post-lapsarian incarnation theory, it was still a direct and necessary moral association of Mary to Adam's sin. And so this is where they started talking about the debitum and the debitum proximum and remote. I had a discussion with Gideon Lazar from the Byzantine Scotus, and the typology becomes rather baroque and complex in the various ways in which the debitum proximum and debitum remotum are carried out. But essentially, to kind of cut the Gordian knot, Scotus never speaks of any debitum to sin. For him, that is incompatible with God's creative will and with ramifications in the order of execution of salvation history and the way in which those events play out. He speaks exclusively in terms of a debitum justitiae. So once Adam and Eve were created, constituted in nature, and then given this the what you could call preternatural or supernatural gifts of original justice, that's what they were. That's what they had a debt to preserve. And so the only debt is to preserve justice, which is a positive perfection. It's not a negative imperfection or blight or taint or stain on that nature. So Scotus would just simply say that affirming any debt or moral obligation or physical obligation of Mary to contract original sin is just simply wrong-headed. The reason why for Scotus we contract original sin is because of a decree that we contract original sin. And for Scotus, that means being born without original justice. And his creation theology and his anthropology are quite involved in order to justify that explanation, and we can't really do justice to that. But I think the key point is that the whole notion of the debitum is, I think, wrongly conceiving the order of creation vis-a-vis Mary in the Immaculate Conception. Rather, there is no debt to contract sin. There's only a debt to preserve justice, and then by virtue of her Immaculate Conception, she not only preserves justice, she exceeds that justice. And so that's the way that typically the Franciscan school would get out of that, is that actually there is no debt to justice. I mean, debt to sin, remote or proximate. It's just a misconstrual of the conditions, the covenantal conditions under which Adam was placed in the initial creation. There was a debt to justice, and in the failure to preserve that justice, then you have the notion of original sin, and the decree then to be born without that original justice is distinct. But there's no debt to sin. It's rather a decree that you're being born without that original justice, or conceived without that original justice.
I suppose as a way to close the episode, how much would you say is Scotus's Christology a consequence of the Franciscan intellectual tradition? So we're thinking like Bonaventure, Alexander of Hales, those crowd of people, or even like a step further, like how much of it is a consequence of just being in the order of Friars Minor, like the tradition that he was brought up in?
I think it's deeply rooted in that. St. Bonaventure doesn't cite St. Francis many times until he gets into the later mystical writings. I think Scotus only cites St. Francis maybe once in his writings, but Scotus he didn't live long enough to, or at least we don't have his mystical writings. Apparently there is a treatise that is debatable, and I'm not an expert on this, on spiritual perfection that Scotus may be composed, but I have not seen that. And I don't know if he cites St. Francis. But nevertheless, I think the positive insight into all of creation primarily as a gifted, a donum expression of divine love, and then that love in terms of its realization on the part of God in the creative act and the ordering of creation and salvation history, kind of in this kind of maximalist sense. I mean, Scotus himself says, so long as Scripture or the Church doesn't contradict me, I prefer to affirm that which is greatest or greater to Christ than that which is lesser. But that is clearly rooted in St. Francis and the spirituality that became indicative, especially through the writings of St. Bonaventure, sort of translating the mystical life and insights St. Francis into theology, the primacy of gift, the primacy of charity, the primacy of the will. All of these things are reflected in Scotus and probably developed to a state of theological or academic theological perfection that was hither, up to that point, not achieved and probably surpassed in its essence. So I think absolutely Scotus is a reflection of the kind of new reality that St. Francis was in the Western Church, and perhaps with respect especially to his theology of the economy, his most perfect expositor. But so far as he came to these insights, I don't think, and I don't know the text of Hales as well as I do St. Bonaventure. Bonaventure clearly was a student of Hales, but Hales, I think, entered the order long after he was formed as a master. I think he was in his mid-40s. And so there's a question with Hales as with St. Anthony of Padua. Clearly they were Franciscans and great Franciscans, but what was specifically Franciscan in terms of its inspiration from Francis and the prophetic and charismatic reality and order that he started, that's a subject that becomes crystallized and clarified in the writings of St. Bonaventure with respect to the relationship between faith and reason, the approach of the theological approach of Bonaventure ramified and clarified in Scotus and expanded in terms of theology being primarily a practical discipline because it's rooted in and ordered towards the perfection of charity. All of these things are deeply indicative of the kind of inflection that you get from the Seraphic Father. And then in terms of Trinitarian theology, while Scotus provides a great deal of depth of insight, he doesn't depart, in my opinion, in substance from Bonaventure. So Bonaventure laid out the framework in terms of Trinitarian theology and the general approach of the Christian scholar to the questions of the relationship between creation and grace, reason and faith, and so on. And Bonaventure really doesn't depart that much. I mean, Scotus doesn't depart that much from the general thematic approach, the topics that he takes up, and the way in which he conceives of their interrelation. What he does, however, is perfect and draw to its ultimate, or to their ultimate conclusions, the implications of St. Francis and what he did in the writings of St. Bonaventure with respect to the economy of salvation. This is where Scotus really does provide something, I wouldn't say new, because I think Scotus is deeply scriptural and deeply patristic, but he provides as an organization and a systematic exposition that was, up to that point, as I've already mentioned, not achieved, and still, perhaps, in my opinion, never surpassed.
All right. Well, Dr. Goff, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
I was very happy to do it, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things and your patience of Methuselah or Abraham in terms of my long-windedness. So it's
always so profound. Thank you.